Avicenna, Omar Khayyam, Ferdowsi, Rudaki, Al-Biruni. If you are familiar with the history of science and literature, these names are familiar to you. A physician whose works were studied in European universities as early as the 17th century. A poet whose quatrains are still being translated today. The author of a national epic on which he worked for 30 years. A scientist who calculated the circumference of the earth with an accuracy unattainable for his era. What unites them? They were all born and raised in the same region, in a region that no longer exists. And it was called Great Khorasan. Friends, welcome to the Amazing History Channel, a channel about great civilizations, empires, and people who changed the course of history. Today we will talk about a region that was once one of the main centers of science, poetry, and trade in Eurasia. And special thanks to the channel's sponsors. It is thanks to your support that we can release major historical videos like this. Thank you for your trust and for helping the channel grow. And now, let's begin. So, before we begin, we need to clear up some confusion. When you hear the word Khorasan, today you are most likely thinking of one of four completely different things. First of all, it's a province in the northeast of modern Iran. Secondly, it's the historical name of a vast region that covered the territories of present-day Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And thirdly, and this is important for understanding today's world, it's the name that the terrorist organization ISIS uses for its Afghan branch, specifically appealing to medieval symbolism. We will talk about the second meaning, about Greater Khorasan, about a region that was real, vast, and incredibly significant, and which most people today simply don't know about. To begin with, let's understand exactly where Greater Khorasan was located. So imagine a huge quadrangle of land. On the west, its border ran roughly where the Iranian city of Dehqans and the Dashti Kavir desert are located today. To the east, it stretched to the banks of the Amu Darya, the river that the ancient Greeks called the Oxus. To the north, it was bordered by the steppes of Central Asia, and to the south by the mountain ranges of Afghanistan and the edge of the Iranian deserts. That's about 2 million square kilometers more than all of Western Europe. But what made this region special? It wasn't its size, it was its location. Khorasan was at the crossroads of all the main routes between east and west. Any merchant traveling from China to the Mediterranean would pass through it. Any army seeking to conquer Central Asia from the west or Iran from the east had to pass through it. Khorasan was a kind of corridor through which history moved. And at the very heart of this corridor stood four cities. Four cities that medieval geographers called the mothers of Khorasan: Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh. Remember these names, they will appear more than once throughout my story. Not in the Islamic Middle Ages, but much further back than one might expect. In the 3rd millennium BC, around the same time when pyramids were being built in Egypt and the first cities were flourishing in Mesopotamia, an urban civilization emerged in Central Asia. Scholars call it the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex. It was a true urban culture with monumental architecture, palaces, temples, advanced crafts, and trade connections stretching from the Indus to Mesopotamia. Its centers were located precisely in the territory of what would become Khorasan, in the vicinity of Balkh and Merv. We don't know what the people of this civilization called themselves. We can't read their inscriptions if they even had any. But their cities and their bronze artifacts, their distinctive seals and ceramics tell us that here, on this land, thousands of years ago, people already knew how to build, trade, and create a complex society. This is important because when the Persians, Greeks, Parthians, and Arabs later come here, they will arrive in a region with deep roots, with established traditions, and with a population that knows how to survive and adapt while preserving its identity. By around the 1st millennium BC, the territory of what would become Khorasan was inhabited by Iranian tribes who spoke languages of the Iranian branch of the Indo-European family. It is their descendants who will create the great cultures that we will talk about later. The three main historical regions on this land had names that you may have come across in history textbooks about Alexander the Great. These are Bactria in the north, in the Amu Darya Valley, in the area of present-day northern Afghanistan, Margiana to the west, in a river oasis in what is now Turkmenistan, and Arya even further west. Each of these regions had its own characteristics, its own climate, its own trade routes, and its own local culture, but they were all connected by a common language, shared religious traditions, and a common destiny. When, in the 6th century BC, the Persian kings from the Achaemenid dynasty began to create the first world empire in their history, all three regions became part of it. This empire was the first state to officially include the territory of future Khorasan within its borders and give it an administrative structure. In Persian royal inscriptions, Bactria and Arya are mentioned as separate satrapies or provinces. They paid taxes, supplied warriors to the royal army, and participated in the complex administrative machinery that the Persians created to govern their vast empire. This was the first time that the land of what would become Khorasan became part of a large political system, but as it would turn out, it was not the last time in history. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great burned Persepolis. It was a symbolic gesture marking the end of the Achaemenid Empire and the end of the Persian world order. But for Alexander, it was only the beginning, because there were still lands in the east that had not yet bowed before him. And among them were Bactria and Arya. Alexander moved eastward. The first city on his path was Artaquana. The local satraps surrendered at first, but then started a rebellion. Alexander returned, suppressed it, and founded a new city on the site of the existing settlement. He named it Alexandria in Arya. This was one of the many cities that Alexander founded along his route as strongholds of Hellenistic culture in the conquered lands. Today, the city of Herat stands on this site. Its history spans more than 2,000 years, and it begins precisely with the Macedonian conquest. But the real challenge awaited Alexander further on in Bactria. Bactria proved to be a very different opponent. Its last Achaemenid satrap, Bessus, proclaimed himself the new king of Persia and organized resistance. Alexander pursued him through the mountains of the Hindu Kush, and it was one of the most difficult crossings in the history of his campaign. Snow, altitude, lack of food. The army suffered but kept moving forward. Bessus was eventually betrayed by his own supporters and handed over to Alexander, but this did not stop the resistance. A Bactrian aristocrat named Spitamenes raised a rebellion that lasted for 2 years and became perhaps the most serious military challenge during Alexander's entire campaign to the east. Spitamenes used guerrilla warfare tactics, sudden strikes, retreating into the steppe, and wearing down the enemy. The Macedonians suffered losses. Alexander was angry. In the end, Spitamenes was killed, according to one version, by his own nomadic allies, who had been bribed or intimidated by the Macedonians. The resistance was crushed. But Alexander realized something important. This land couldn't just be conquered and left behind. He needed to stay here. He needed to settle here for that. That's why he married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian aristocrat. This became a symbol that he intended to become a part of this land, not just its conqueror. His officers followed his example. Many of them married local women at the famous mass wedding in Susa. It was a major attempt to create a new mixed elite, Greco-Iranian. Alexander went further to India and then died in Babylon in 323 BC, not living to the age of 33. His empire immediately began to fall apart, torn to pieces by his generals, the Diadochi. The east went to Seleucus, the founder of the Seleucid dynasty. But here, on the future lands of Khorasan, something remarkable happened. Around 250 BC, Bactria separated from the Seleucid Empire and became an independent kingdom. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom was one of the most unusual political experiments of the ancient world. Greek kings ruling in the center of Asia, surrounded by Iranian and Indian populations, issuing coins in 2 languages at once. These very coins became one of the most eloquent artifacts of the era. Look at them and you'll see the Greek style, the king's profile on one side and Buddhist or Zoroastrian symbols on the other. This is not just metal with inscriptions. This is evidence that a gradual blending of Greek, Iranian and Indian cultures was taking place in the region. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom lasted just over 100 years. It was destroyed by nomadic tribes from the north, the Yuezhi, who historians also associate with the later Kushans. But its cultural legacy did not disappear. The synthesis that began under Alexander the Great left a profound mark on the art, architecture, and religious life of the region. Buddhist monasteries in Bactria, Greek columns in Asian cities, Iranian Zoroastrian temples next to Hellenistic gymnasiums. It was a world where different civilizations interacted, borrowing from each other and creating something new. And this ability to absorb the foreign and turn it into their own would probably become the main feature of Khorasan throughout its entire history. After the collapse of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, the lands of what would become Khorasan came under the influence of a new power, the Parthians, an Iranian-speaking people who came from the steppes southeast of the Caspian Sea. Their kingdom, the Parthian Empire or the Arsacid state, became one of the great powers of the ancient world. It was the Parthians who stopped Roman expansion to the east. It was they who controlled the western section of the Silk Road for almost 5 centuries. And it was through their territory that trade routes connecting China with Rome passed. It's impossible to understand the significance of Khorasan during the Parthian period without understanding what the Silk Road actually was. It wasn't a single road. It was a network of routes, branching, vibrant, and constantly changing, and Khorasan was at its very center. Silks and spices from the east passed through it. Glass, gold, and wine from the west passed through it. The cities we already know, Nishapur, Merv, Herat, and Balkh, were hubs of this trade network. Places where merchants from dozens of cities met, where they exchanged goods, ideas, and religions. It was during the Parthian period that Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian religion founded by the prophet Zarathustra, became established in the region. Fire as a symbol of divine purity, the struggle between good and evil as the foundation of the universe. Zoroastrian temples were built throughout Khorasan, and the priestly class became an important part of local society. But Khorasan was never religiously uniform. Alongside Zoroastrian temples, there were Buddhist monasteries, a legacy of the Kushan period. The Kushan kingdom, which succeeded the Greco-Bactrians in the eastern part of the region, was one of the main patrons of Buddhism in history. It was through the Kushan kingdom that Buddhism spread from India to Central Asia and further into China. The famous Bamiyan Buddha statues, the very ones that the Taliban destroyed in 2001, were created in this very tradition. As you can see, Khorasan in the 1st centuries AD was a place of incredible cultural diversity. And then, in the 3rd century AD, the Sasanians arrived. The Sasanian Empire was the last great pre-Islamic Persian state. Its founder, Ardashir I, overthrew the last Parthian king in 224 AD and proclaimed the revival of Iranian statehood. The Sasanians saw themselves as the heirs of the Achaemenids, the rightful guardians of Iranian tradition and the Zoroastrian faith. For Khorasan, the Sasanian conquest meant a new level of administrative organization, and it was under the Sasanians that the region received its name for the first time. Khorasan, that's how it sounded in the Persian language of the Sasanian era. Khor means sun, Asan means rising. The land of the rising sun. It was not just a geographical name, it was an administrative concept. The Sasanians created a special military administrative zone from the eastern territories of their empire. And all because nomads lived to the east and north of Khorasan. First the Hephthalites, the so-called White Huns, then the Turkic Khaganates, which emerged in the 6th century and quickly spread their influence from Mongolia to the Black Sea region. The border of Khorasan was the boundary between the settled Iranian world and the nomadic steppe. And maintaining this border was one of the main tasks of the Sasanian kings. For this purpose, they created a special system of governance. Khorasan was granted a high degree of autonomy. Local landowners, the Dehqans, kept their rights and status by staying loyal to the central authority and helping defend the borders. The Dehqans collected taxes, managed irrigation systems, and maintained local military units. They were the backbone of provincial society. Thus, a class of people emerged who were deeply rooted in the local land, possessed resources and administrative experience, preserved Iranian cultural identity, and at the same time maintained relative independence from the distant central authority. The Dehqans of Khorasan, remember them, because they will become the main characters in the next chapter of our story. They are the ones who will face the Arab conquerors. They are the ones who will survive the conquest. And it is they who will ultimately determine what Khorasan will become under Islamic rule. In 632 AD, the Prophet Muhammad passed away. The Arabian Peninsula, which the Persians considered the edge of the civilized world, a hot desert with warlike tribes that posed no serious threat, suddenly became the source of one of the fastest military expansions in human history. Arab armies advanced in two directions at once, westward against the Byzantine Empire and northward against Sasanian Persia. As early as 636, the Arabs defeated the main Persian army at the Battle of Qadisiyah, and then their capital, Ctesiphon, fell. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled to Khorasan, and the Arabs pursued him. The war against Khorasan began around the 650s and lasted for several decades. It was not a single swift campaign, but rather a series of expeditions, negotiations, local surrenders, and periodic uprisings. Different cities surrendered under different conditions. Nishapur opened its gates relatively peacefully. Merv made a treaty after brief resistance. Herat capitulated, and Balkh resisted for longer. Yazdegerd and found no refuge. He wandered through the eastern outskirts of his former empire, trying to gather troops and organize resistance, but no one believed in the possibility of victory anymore. In 651, he was killed, according to one version, by a simple miller who coveted his clothes. With his fall, the Sasanian Empire ceased to exist. But here's what's important to understand. The conquest of a state and the conquest of a people are two completely different things. The Arabs destroyed the Sasanian political system. They appointed their own governors, they started collecting taxes, but they did not destroy what made Khorasan Khorasan. And this brings us back to the Dehqans. The Iranian landowning aristocracy turned out to be surprisingly resilient to conquest. The Arab governors needed people who knew how to manage the complex irrigation system, collect taxes, keep records, and resolve local disputes. But the Arabs didn't have such people. However, the Dehqans did, and they stayed in their positions. The Dehqans converted to Islam and learned to speak Arabic, just enough to conduct business with their new masters. But they kept their lands and their local connections. They continued to speak Iranian languages at home, celebrate Iranian holidays, read Iranian poetry, and honor the memory of Iranian kings. It was a quiet, invisible form of resistance. Just the persistent, patient preservation of what made up the essence of Iranian identity, but patience has its limits. The Umayyad Caliphate governed its provinces on principles that became increasingly unbearable for the local population. The essence of the problem was simple and painful. Islam proclaimed the equality of all believers before God. But in practice, the Umayyads created a system in which Arabs were a privileged class, while newly converted Muslims of non-Arab origin were treated as second-class people. An Iranian who converted to Islam still had to pay taxes that, in theory, were supposed to be levied only on non-Muslims. An Iranian could not hold a high position on par with an Arab. This resentment accumulated for decades. And it accumulated specifically in Khorasan, a region that had grown used to autonomy since the time of the Sassanids. And by the middle of the 8th century, there was something in the air that could only be described with one word: a storm. And that storm was brought by a man named Abu Muslim. Abu Muslim appeared in Khorasan as if out of nowhere. His origins are shrouded in mystery. Some sources call him an Iranian from the vicinity of Isfahan, others say he was a native of Khorasan itself, still others hint at connections with the Arab nobility. He was young, possibly no older than 20 when he began his activities. And at the same time, he possessed a gift that is extremely rare, the ability to persuade people to risk their lives for an idea. And the idea was simple and powerful. The Umayyads betrayed Islam. They turned the religion of equality into a tool of Arab domination. It was time to restore justice, and power should pass to the descendants of the Prophet, to the Abbasid family, who preserved the purity of the original message. In 747, Abu Muslim raised the black banners of the Abbasids in Khorasan, the color of mourning for the slain descendants of the Prophet and the color of the coming retribution. And people flocked to these banners. The Dehqans with their resources and connections. Iranian Christians, tired of unfair taxes, freedmen, second-class Muslims who had nothing to lose, and the Arab tribes of Khorasan dissatisfied with the central authority. The Umayyad governor of Khorasan, Nasr ibn Sayyar, realized what was happening. He sent a desperate message to Damascus, begging for help, but Damascus did not respond in time. The Umayyad Caliphate was torn apart by internal conflicts, by intertribal feuds and uprisings on other frontiers. It had neither the strength nor the will for a decisive response in the east, and Abu Muslim took advantage of this. In 3 years, his army marched through all of Khorasan, Iran, and Iraq. The Umayyad troops fought, but time and again they suffered defeat. In January 750, on the banks of the Great Zab River in northern Iraq, a decisive battle took place. The last Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, was defeated. He fled to Egypt, where he was soon caught and killed. The Umayyad Caliphate ceased to exist. The Abbasids came to power, and the first thing they did was move the capital of the Islamic world to a new city built on the banks of the Tigris. In 762, it was officially named Madinat as-Salam, the City of Peace. But it went down in history under another name, Baghdad. And the role of Khorasan in its construction is hard to overestimate. After all, if you look at the Abbasid court, who ran the machinery of the state? Who held the positions of viziers? Who led the army, the treasury, and diplomacy? Again and again, you will encounter Iranian names. And the most striking example was the Barmakid family. The Barmakids came from Balkh. According to one version, their ancestors were Buddhist priests, guardians of the famous Balkh temple. They converted to Islam, and the Barmakids had a dazzling career at the Abbasid court. For several decades, the Barmakids effectively ruled the caliphate on behalf of the caliphs. They built libraries, supported scholars, and financed the translation of Greek and Indian texts into Arabic. The famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the greatest intellectual project of the Middle Ages, was established with the direct involvement of people whose roots traced back to Khorasan. There is a paradox in this. The Arabs conquered Khorasan, but Khorasan conquered the Abbasid court, the caliphate. The Arabic language remained the language of religion, law, and high scholarship. But the Persian language, transformed, enriched with Arabic vocabulary, and written in the Arabic alphabet, began its revival precisely during this period. And the center of this revival became Khorasan. However, let's return to Abu Muslim. His story has an ending that says more about the nature of power than any political science textbook. Abu Muslim made the Abbasids caliphs. Without him, they would have never come to power. His name was spoken with reverence throughout Khorasan. His popularity among the local population was so immense that the new caliph began to fear it. In 755, Caliph al-Mansur invited Abu Muslim to a meeting and treacherously killed him. The body of the conqueror of the caliphate was thrown into the Tigris. But Khorasan did not forget this. Several uprisings that broke out in the following decades were directly connected to the memory of Abu Muslim. His image turned into a symbol of Khorasan's independence and justice, betrayed by those for whom he fought. In 819, another small Iranian dynasty received the right to rule Khorasan from the Abbasid Caliph. They were called the Tahirids. They were descendants of those very Dehqans. Tahir ibn Hussein, the founder of the dynasty, was a brilliant military commander in the service of the caliphate. He was rewarded with what he valued most of all, power over his native land. The Tahirids ruled for a short time, only half a century, but they opened a door that no one could close again. The door to Iranian political independence within the Islamic world. After the Tahirids came the Safavids, a dynasty that emerged in the southeast of the region, in Sistan. Their founder, Yaqub ibn Layth, was, according to legend, a coppersmith, a man of the people who rose through military strength and personal valor. The Safavids were rougher, more warlike, and less inclined toward cultural patronage, but they did something historically important. Yaqub ibn Layth refused to conduct official business in Arabic. He demanded that his court poets compose poetry in Persian. But the true flourishing was brought by another dynasty, whose name became synonymous with the Iranian cultural revival, the Samanids. The Samanids came to power at the end of the 9th century. They ruled Khorasan and Central Asia until the year 990. Their capital was Bukhara. The city is outside of Khorasan, but is closely connected with its fate. At the Samanid court, the Persian language took its rightful place as the language of high culture, poetry, philosophy, and science. Imagine Samanid Nishapur at the turn of the 10th and 11th centuries. According to historians' estimates, it had a population of between 200,000 and 500,000 people. It was one of the largest cities in the world, comparable to Baghdad and Constantinople. Its bazaars traded in silk, spices, books, and metal goods. Its madrasas attracted scholars from all over the Islamic world, and dozens of languages could be heard on its streets. And it was in this city and in other cities of Samanid Khorasan that the people whose names you heard at the very beginning of our story lived and worked. Rudaki Ferdowsi Albiruni Avicenna. The Samanids created conditions in which Iranian civilization could breathe freely, and it responded with an explosion of creative energy unparalleled in medieval history. But this golden age had a weak spot. The Samanids relied on Turkic military slaves, ghulams, as the backbone of their army. This was a common practice in the Islamic world. Turkic youths were bought or captured in the steppes. They were raised at court. They converted to Islam, and they became professional warriors, personally loyal to their master. But professional warriors with weapons in their hands are people who sooner or later start to ask the question, why do we serve instead of ruling? One of these ghulams was named Sibuktegin. His son was given the name Mahmud at birth. And it was Mahmud of Ghazni who, in 999, delivered the final blow to the Samanid state, which was already weakened by internal conflicts and the pressure of Turkic tribes from Siberia. This marked the end of the golden age of Samanid Khorasan. Mahmud of Ghazni was a Turk and spoke a Turkic language. However, he became one of the greatest patrons of Persian culture. At his court in Ghazni, a city in present-day Afghanistan, the greatest poets, scholars, and artists of the era gathered. And all this was because Persian culture offered something that the steppe warriors did not have: a language of power, a tradition of governance, and an aesthetic worthy of great kings. After the Ghaznavids came the Seljuks. The Seljuks were different. If the Ghaznavids came from the ranks of court slaves and maintained a close connection with urban culture, the Seljuks came from the depths of the steppes. They were the leaders of the august Turkic tribes who swept through Central Asia at the beginning of the 11th century like a steppe wildfire. In 1038 they captured Nishapur, and in 1055 their leader Tagrul entered Baghdad and received the title of Sultan, the protector of Islam, from the Abbasid Caliph. At its height, the Seljuk Empire stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of China. It was one of the largest powers of the medieval world. And its administrative heart once again became Khorasan. And it is here that we should talk about a man whose story is perhaps the best illustration of how the Khorasan civilizational machine worked. His name was Nizam al-Mulk. He was born in 1018 in a small town near Tuz. His father was a minor official. He himself received an excellent education at the madrasa in Nishapur and made a career serving the Ghaznavids. And then he entered Seljuk service. Under Sultan Alp Arslan, and then under Malik Shah, Nizam al-Mulk held the position of Grand Vizier for almost 30 years. In fact, he ruled the empire. The Turkic sultans fought, hunted, received ambassadors, while Nizam al-Mulk governed. This was Khorasan in the 11th century. Multi-layered, multilingual, incredibly complex, yet still functioning. In 1092, Nizam al-Mulk was killed by an assassin, a member of the Ismaili organization operating from the mountain fortresses of Iran. That same year, Sultan Malik Shah died. The Seljuk Empire began to break apart, torn by struggles over succession. The 12th century saw a series of upheavals in Khorasan. New Turkic tribes, the Karakitans and the Oghuz, swept through the region, destroying cities and disrupting trade routes. Nishapur changed hands several times. The world suffered from raids. The old order was falling apart at the seams, and then from the east came a force that Khorasan had never encountered before. In 1220 an army came to the region. It was led by a man whom Chinese sources called the Shaker of the Universe. Genghis Khan, the Mongol leader who united the steppe tribes and built a military machine of unprecedented efficiency. The Mongol campaign against Khorasan looked more like systematic destruction. Genghis Khan and his generals moved from city to city with a methodical approach that terrified contemporaries and continues to horrify historians 8 centuries later. In 1221, the Mongol army under the command of Tolui, the son of Genghis Khan, captured and destroyed Merv, wiping out its inhabitants. Then the same fate befell Nishapur and Balkh. Herat initially surrendered and was spared, but then it rebelled. The Mongols returned and carried out 7 days of systematic destruction there. 4 great cities, the foremothers of Khorasan, lay in ruins. But the Mongol invasion was not only about physical destruction. It struck at the very foundation of Khorasan civilization, its irrigation infrastructure. All life in Khorasan depended on water. In the arid climate of the region, the existence of cities and agriculture was only possible thanks to complex systems of underground canals that collected groundwater and delivered it to fields and cities. These systems were built and maintained for centuries. They required constant upkeep, knowledge, and manpower. The Mongols, however, killed the people who knew how to build and maintain them, and without them, the irrigation systems could not be restored even after the end of the hostilities. The lands that used to feed millions of people turned into a desert. The demographic collapse that followed the Mongol invasion was one of the largest in human history. Modern demographic studies show that the population of Iran and Central Asia decreased by 50 to 70% as a result of the Mongol conquests. Some regions never recovered their pre-Islamic population levels. A century and a half after Chinggis Khan, another conqueror came from those same Central Asian steppes. His name was Timur. He was a paradox embodied in a man. Timur destroyed with Mongol ruthlessness. Towers of skulls by the walls of conquered cities became his calling card. And at the same time, he gathered artists, architects, poets, and scholars from all the conquered territories and brought them to his capital, Samarkand. But Timur's heirs went even further. His son Shahrukh chose Herat as his residence, and under him, and then under his son Ulugh Beg and great-grandson Hussein Baikara, Herat experienced the last great flowering of Khorasan civilization. Timurid Herat of the 15th century is what historians sometimes call the Florence of the East, and this comparison is not an exaggeration. At the court of Hussein Baikara, the great poet and statesman Ali Shernavoy created his works. He was the first to elevate the Chagatai Turkic language to the level of a literary language. The painter Behzad worked here, the Raphael of the East, whose miniatures are still considered the pinnacle of Islamic visual art. Here, mosques, madrasas, and libraries were built, rivaling the world's finest examples of architecture in their beauty. This was the last great breath of Khorasan. In the 16th century, the region was divided between Safavid Persia in the west and the Uzbek Khanates in the north and east. Then came the Afghan tribes. Then, in the 19th century, the interests of the Russian and British empires met here in the Great Game. Borders were drawn and redrawn, and by the 20th century, what was once the unified Great Khorasan had been divided among several states. Its lands today lie in Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and partly in Tajikistan. The history of Khorasan is a history of creation, not destruction. It is the story of people who, time and again, found ways to create beauty and knowledge in the midst of conquests and disasters. Well, that's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, please support it with a like and a subscription. This helps the channel grow and shows the algorithms that viewers are interested in historical topics like this. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone. Subtitles.